The black lace veil hung heavy against Wilhelmina Walsh's face as she stepped off the stagecoach into the dust-choked street of Desdemona, Texas, her gloved hands trembling despite the oppressive heat of the August afternoon in 1883. She had traveled for 3 weeks to reach this oil boom town nestled in the scrubland of central Texas, carrying nothing but a worn carpet bag and the weight of a past that had marked her in ways no one could see beneath the dark fabric that concealed half her face. The town sprawled before her in a chaos of hastily constructed buildings, oil derricks piercing the horizon like skeletal fingers, and the air thick with the smell of petroleum and desperate ambition. Wilhelmina had answered an advertisement for a seamstress position at the general store, her carefully penned letter making no mention of the fire that had ravaged her family's farm in Missouri 2 years prior, the flames that had stolen her parents and younger brother, and left the right side of her face a landscape of puckered, reddened skin that made children cry and grown men look away in discomfort. She had learned quickly that people judged what they could see, so she had fashioned the veil from her mother's old mourning dress, telling herself it was proper for a woman still grieving, even though the real reason hung unspoken in every interaction. The proprietor of Walsh General Goods, a distant cousin she had never met named Judith Walsh, had written back with cautious acceptance, noting that the town was growing so rapidly that another pair of skilled hands would be welcome, veil or no veil. Wilhelmina had sold everything that remained of her family's property and bought a ticket west, chasing the slim hope that, in a place where everyone was running from something, perhaps no one would ask too many questions about what she was running from. She made her way down the wooden boardwalk, aware of the stares that followed her veiled figure. A group of roughnecks fresh from the oil fields whistled and called out, but she kept her eyes forward, her posture rigid with the defensive pride she had cultivated over 2 years of unwanted attention. The general store occupied a corner lot on the main street, its false front painted with optimistic letters promising dry goods, fabric, and notions. A bell chimed as she pushed through the door, and a woman in her 50s looked up from behind the counter, her face weathered but kind. "You must be Wilhelmina," Judith said, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "I am glad you made it safely. The roads have been terrible with all the traffic coming through." "Thank you for the opportunity, madam," Wilhelmina replied, her voice slightly muffled by the veil. "I am ready to begin work whenever you need me." Judith studied her for a long moment, and Wilhelmina braced herself for the inevitable questions about her face covering, but the older woman simply nodded. "You look exhausted from your journey. Let me show you to your room upstairs, and you can start fresh tomorrow morning. We open at dawn, and there is always a line of men waiting for supplies before they head out to the rigs." The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the back alley. Wilhelmina set down her bag and removed her dusty traveling cloak, but the veil remained in place even when she was alone. She had grown so accustomed to its presence that removing it felt like standing naked, exposed to a world that had already decided she was something to pity or avoid. She lay down on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Desdemona drifting through the window, the shouts of men, the creak of wagons, the distant clang of machinery that never seemed to stop. Sleep came fitfully, and when dawn broke, she was already dressed and downstairs before Judith emerged from her own quarters. The older woman showed her around the store, pointing out where different supplies were kept, explaining the bookkeeping system, and introducing her to the small sewing area set up in the back corner, where she would spend most of her time mending work clothes, hemming trousers, and occasionally crafting a dress for one of the few respectable women in town. The morning passed in a blur of customers, most of them men who barely glanced at her veiled face, too focused on getting what they needed and returning to work. Wilhelmina found a strange comfort in their indifference, though she noticed a few who stared with open curiosity or whispered to their companions. She kept her responses brief and professional, her needle flying through fabric during the lulls between customers. It was nearly noon when the door opened, and a man walked in who seemed to fill the entire space with his presence. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face sun-bronzed beneath the brim of a dusty Stetson hat, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was and made no apologies for it. His dark hair was slightly too long, curling at the collar of his faded blue shirt, and his eyes were the color of creek water, green-brown and steady. "Afternoon, Miss Judith," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried a trace of Tennessee in its vowels. "I need some new work gloves and a couple pounds of coffee if you have got it." "Yates," Judith greeted him warmly. "I heard you were back in town. How did the cattle drive go?" "Well enough," Yates Foster replied, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "We got a fair price in Fort Worth, and I managed to keep most of the herd together despite a stampede outside of Stephenville. But I am glad to be back on solid ground for a while." It was then that his gaze drifted to where Wilhelmina sat at her sewing station, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. Most men either stared too openly or looked away too quickly, but Yates simply met her eyes through the veil with an expression of polite interest, as though her covering were as unremarkable as a Sunday hat. "I do not believe we have met," he said, crossing the room with a few long strides. "Yates Foster. I've got a small ranch about 5 miles outside town." Wilhelmina hesitated, unused to such straightforward courtesy. "Wilhelmina Walsh. I am Miss Judith's cousin from Missouri. I arrived yesterday." "Welcome to Desdemona," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "It is not much to look at, but the people are decent enough, and there is always work if you are willing to sweat for it." "So I have observed," she replied, gesturing toward the pile of torn work shirts waiting for her attention. He laughed, a rich sound that seemed to ease some tight place in her chest. "I reckon I am responsible for at least 3 of those. Ranch work is hard on clothing. If you are taking commissions, I could use a new shirt. The cattle do not care if I look presentable, but I've got business in town often enough that I should probably not walk around with my elbows showing through the fabric." "I can certainly help with that," Wilhelmina said, reaching for her measuring tape. "If you have time now, I can take your measurements." What followed was one of the most excruciating experiences of Wilhelmina's recent life. Standing close enough to Yates Foster to measure his shoulders, chest, and arms meant breathing in the scent of him. Clean sweat and leather, and something earthy that spoke of open spaces and hard work. He stood perfectly still while she worked, but she was acutely aware of the heat radiating from his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his muscles shifted beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. "You have got steady hands," he observed, watching her work. "That is good for this kind of detail." "Practice," she managed, trying to focus on the numbers she was recording rather than the fact that she was touching a man who made her feel things she had thought died in the fire along with everything else. "When do you need the shirt completed?" "No rush," he said easily. "Whenever you have time between all those repairs, I will pay you fairly for the work." She quoted him a price that was reasonable but not cheap, half expecting him to balk, but he simply nodded and pulled a few bills from his pocket, handing them over as a deposit. His fingers brushed hers during the exchange, and she jerked back as though burned, the old instinct to avoid contact still sharp despite the gloves they both wore. If he noticed her reaction, he gave no sign of it. He collected his gloves and coffee from Judith, settled his hat back on his head, and tipped the brim in Wilhelmina's direction. "I look forward to seeing what you create, Miss Walsh. Good day to you both." After he left, Judith came over with a knowing smile. "That is one of the good ones," she said quietly. "Yates came to Texas about 5 years ago with nothing but a horse and his saddle. Worked as a ranch hand, then a trail boss, saved every penny, and bought a piece of land that nobody else wanted because the water rights were complicated. He spent 2 years in court fighting the previous owner's claims, and won because he had right on his side and was too stubborn to quit. Now he has got a small herd, a decent house, and a reputation as a man who keeps his word." "That is admirable," Wilhelmina said carefully, already bending back over her work to hide the confusion of feelings churning in her chest. "He is 26, never been married, and half the unmarried women in Desdemona have set their caps for him," Judith continued, ignoring Wilhelmina's obvious discomfort. "But he is particular about who he spends time with. He does not care for shallow people or social climbers. He wants someone with substance." "That has nothing to do with me," Wilhelmina said firmly. "I am here to work, not to find a husband." Judith patted her shoulder gently. "Sometimes what we come looking for and what we find are two different things, dear. Just keep your heart open to possibilities." But Wilhelmina had learned the hard way that possibilities were for women with smooth skin and easy smiles, not for those who hid behind veils and carried scars that went deeper than the surface. She threw herself into her work with renewed focus, finishing 2 repairs before the afternoon was half over and starting on the pattern for Yates Foster's new shirt with meticulous attention to detail. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was almost comforting in its predictability. Wilhelmina woke before dawn, helped Judith open the store, spent her mornings and afternoons sewing while the parade of oil workers, ranchers, and townspeople came and went. She took her meals upstairs in her room, venturing out only for necessities, and even then keeping to the shadows and quiet hours when fewer people were about. Yates came by the store at least twice a week, always with some legitimate errand, but Wilhelmina noticed that he seemed to find excuses to linger near her work area, asking questions about the sewing process, or commenting on the weather, or sharing stories about life on his ranch. He spoke to her as though the veil were not there, as though she were just another person worthy of conversation, and it unsettled her in ways she could not quite articulate. "You ever miss Missouri?" he asked one afternoon, leaning against the counter while she hemmed a pair of trousers. "Sometimes," she admitted. "The landscape was greener, more forgiving than this scrubland, but there is nothing left for me there." "Family?" he probed gently. "All gone," she said, her voice flat with the practiced neutrality she used when discussing the fire. "It has been just me for 2 years now." "I am sorry," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten. "I lost my own folks to fever when I was 19. It is a hard thing, being alone in the world." She looked up at him then, really looked, and saw something in his eyes that matched the hollow place inside her. "How did you manage it?" "I kept moving," he said simply. "Worked myself into exhaustion every day so I would not have to think too much. Eventually the grief faded to something bearable, something I could carry without it crushing me. And I built a new life, piece by piece, until I had something worth protecting again." "That sounds like a good plan," she said softly. "It works until you realize you have built a life but not a home," he replied, his gaze steady on her face. "A home needs people in it, not just walls and a roof." She did not know how to respond to that, so she bent back over her work, her needle moving with fierce concentration until he eventually took the hint and moved on to complete his actual business. But his words stayed with her, circling in her mind like birds looking for a place to land. The shirt she was making for him was perhaps the finest work she had ever done. She used a deep green fabric that she thought would bring out his eyes, reinforced all the stress points so it would withstand hard use, and added small touches of detail in the stitching that most men would never notice, but that satisfied her own need for perfection. When it was finally complete 3 weeks after she had started it, she folded it carefully and set it aside, planning to give it to him the next time he came by the store. She did not have to wait long. He arrived the next morning just as she was opening up, Judith having gone to help a neighbor with a sick child. The early light cast long shadows through the store, and Desdemona was still mostly quiet, the oil workers not yet stirring from their boarding houses and tents. "Morning," Yates said, removing his hat as he stepped inside. "Am I too early?" "No, I was just getting things ready," Wilhelmina replied, smoothing her apron nervously. "Actually, your shirt is finished. Let me get it for you." She retrieved the carefully wrapped package and handed it to him, watching as he unfolded the green fabric and held it up to examine. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes that made her heart beat faster. "This is beautiful work," he said quietly. "The best shirt I have ever owned, I reckon." "I am glad you like it," she said, pleased despite herself. "Would you mind if I tried it on now? Just to make sure the fit is right," she nodded, turning away to give him privacy as he shrugged out of his old shirt and pulled on the new one. When she turned back, he was buttoning it up, and she had to admit that the color was perfect for him, making his sun-bronzed skin seem to glow and his eyes appear more green than brown. "How does it feel?" she asked professionally, though her pulse was racing. "Perfect," he said, rolling his shoulders experimentally. "You have got real talent, Miss Walsh." "Thank you," she murmured. He paid her the remainder of what he owed, adding an extra $1 that she tried to refuse but he insisted she keep. Then he hesitated, his hand on the door, before turning back to face her. "There is a church social this Saturday evening," he said, his voice carefully casual. "Supper and dancing to raise money for the new schoolhouse. I was wondering if you might like to attend with me." The question hung in the air between them, and Wilhelmina felt panic rise in her throat. A social meant crowds, meant people staring, meant questions she had no desire to answer. "I do not think that would be appropriate," she said quickly. "I am still in mourning." "It has been 2 years," he said gently. "I am not trying to be disrespectful to your loss, but at some point you have to let yourself live again." "You do not understand," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I cannot go to something like that." "Why not?" he challenged, taking a step closer. "Give me one good reason." "Because I am not like other women," she burst out, gesturing toward her veil. "Because people will stare and whisper, and you will be embarrassed to be seen with me." His expression hardened, not with anger but with something that looked like determination. "Do you honestly think I am that shallow? I think you are kind and decent, and you do not deserve to be saddled with someone like me," she said, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. "Please, just forget you asked." He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with those creek water eyes that seemed to see right through all her carefully constructed defenses. Then he did something she did not expect. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, reached out, and before she could stop him, gently lifted the edge of her veil. Wilhelmina froze, every muscle in her body locked in place as he slowly raised the black lace, revealing first her chin, then her mouth, then the unmarred left side of her face, and finally the right side with its landscape of scars. the skin shiny and puckered where the flames had eaten away at her, pulling at the corner of her eye and distorting her cheek. She waited for the revulsion, for the pity, for the awkward platitudes that people always offered before making their excuses and retreating. But Yates just looked at her, really looked, his gaze traveling over her face with the same careful attention he had given to the shirt she had made him. "You are beautiful to me," he said simply, and the absolute sincerity in his voice nearly broke her. "Do not lie," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "I know what I look like." "I am not lying," he said firmly, still holding the veil up so there was nothing between them but truth. "I see a woman who survived something terrible, who had the courage to keep going when it would have been easier to give up. I see skill in your hands and intelligence in your eyes, and a heart that is still capable of kindness, even though the world has been cruel to you. That is beautiful, Wilhelmina. That is worth more than perfect skin." The tears spilled over then, tracking down both cheeks, crossing the divide between scarred and unscarred tissue. She had not cried in front of another person since the fire, had taught herself to save her grief for dark nights alone in her room, but something in his words had cracked the dam she had built around her heart. Yates reached up with his free hand and gently wiped the tears away, his touch careful but not tentative, not treating her like something fragile that might break. "Will you come to the social with me?" he asked again. "People will talk," she managed. "Let them," he said. "I stopped caring what small-minded people thought a long time ago." She took a shaky breath, aware that she was standing at a crossroads, that saying yes meant stepping out of the shadows she had been hiding in, meant making herself vulnerable in ways that terrified her. But there was something in Yates Foster's eyes, something solid and true that made her want to be brave enough to try. "All right," she whispered. "I will go with you." He smiled then, a slow sunrise of a smile that transformed his entire face and carefully lowered the veil back into place. "I will pick you up at 6 on Saturday," he said. "Wear something you can dance in." After he left, Wilhelmina sank into her chair, her hands shaking so badly she could not thread a needle. Judith returned an hour later to find her still sitting there, staring at nothing, and the older woman took one look at her face and broke into a knowing smile. "So he finally asked you," Judith said with satisfaction. "I was wondering how long it would take him to work up the courage." "He saw my face," Wilhelmina said numbly. "He lifted the veil and looked at me." "And," Judith prompted. "He said I was beautiful," she whispered, the words still not quite real. Judith came over and gathered her into a hug, and Wilhelmina let herself be held, let herself believe for just a moment that maybe, possibly, there could be a future that did not involve hiding. The days leading up to Saturday passed in a blur of nervous energy. Wilhelmina found herself distracted, pricking her fingers on needles and having to redo seams because she was not paying attention. At night she lay awake, alternating between excitement and terror, imagining all the ways the social could go wrong. On Thursday afternoon, Judith presented her with a length of beautiful blue calico fabric. "For a new dress," she said firmly when Wilhelmina tried to protest. "You cannot go to a social in your work clothes, and that black morning dress is far too heavy for dancing. Consider it an early birthday present." Wilhelmina knew better than to argue when Judith got that particular tone in her voice. She spent Thursday evening and all of Friday cutting and sewing the dress. A simple but flattering design with a fitted bodice and a full skirt that would move well for dancing. She added small touches of white lace at the collar and cuffs, feminine details, that she had not allowed herself in 2 years of wearing nothing but practical, concealing garments. Saturday arrived with a sky so blue, it hurt to look at and temperatures that were blessedly cooler than the scorching heat of the previous weeks. Wilhelmina spent the afternoon helping Judith with the store, but her mind was elsewhere, rehearsing conversations and worrying about whether she should wear the veil or leave it behind. In the end, she compromised, fashioning a lighter veil from some delicate white netting that was less concealing but still provided a barrier between her scars and the world. She dressed carefully, arranging her hair in a simple style that kept it back from her face, and allowed herself a moment to look in the small mirror above her washstand. The woman who looked back at her was still scarred, still marked by tragedy, but there was something different in her eyes, a spark of something that might have been hope. Yates arrived precisely at 6, driving a small wagon that had been recently washed and outfitted with cushioned seats. He wore the green shirt she had made him, paired with dark trousers and a vest, and his boots had been polished to a shine. When he saw her, his face lit up with obvious appreciation. "You look lovely," he said, offering his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. "Thank you," she replied, settling her skirts around her. "You look very handsome yourself." The ride to the church was about 15 minutes, and they spent it in surprisingly comfortable conversation, talking about the changes coming to Desdemona as the oil boom continued, about his plans for expanding his ranch, about her hopes of eventually saving enough money to open her own dressmaking shop. He spoke to her as an equal, seeking her opinions and actually listening to her responses, and she found herself relaxing despite her nerves. The churchyard was already crowded when they arrived, long tables set up under the sprawling branches of several ancient oak trees. Lanterns hung from the branches to provide light as evening fell. Women bustled around with platters of food while men gathered in clusters, and children ran wild in the way that children do when their parents are distracted. Wilhelmina felt every eye turn toward them as Yates helped her down from the wagon, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity settle over her like a physical thing. But he kept his hand at the small of her back, a steady presence, and guided her toward the tables with the confidence of a man who belonged wherever he chose to stand. "Yates, good to see you," called out a heavyset man with a badge pinned to his vest. "And who is your companion?" "Sheriff Davis, this is Miss Wilhelmina Walsh," Yates said easily. "She is Judith's cousin, recently arrived from Missouri. Wilhelmina, Sheriff Davis keeps what passes for law and order around here." The sheriff tipped his hat politely, his gaze flickering to her veil but his expression remaining neutral. "Pleasure, miss. Welcome to Desdemona." More introductions followed, a blur of names and faces that Wilhelmina knew she would never remember. Most people were polite if curious, though she caught a few women whispering behind their hands and saw several men staring with open speculation. She held her head high and responded to every greeting with courtesy, determined not to let her discomfort show. The meal was a communal affair, with everyone contributing dishes and filling their plates from the laden tables. Yates made sure she had plenty of food and found them a spot at one of the long benches where they could sit somewhat apart from the main crowd. She had to lift her veil to eat, and she did so with trembling hands, aware that this was the first time she had revealed her face in such a public setting since the fire. She felt the stares, the double takes, the way conversation seemed to pause and then resume with forced normalcy. But Yates continued eating and talking as though nothing were unusual, telling her a funny story about a cow that had gotten stuck in a creek bed, and his easy manner helped calm her racing heart. After the meal, several men brought out fiddles and a guitar, and the dancing began. Couples paired off and moved through reels and waltzes with varying degrees of skill, and the atmosphere grew more festive as the evening progressed. Wilhelmina watched from the sidelines, content to observe, but Yates had other ideas. "Dance with me," he said, rising and offering his hand. "I have not danced in years," she protested. "I will probably step all over your feet. Then I will consider it fair payment for all the work you put into this shirt," he teased, and she found herself laughing despite her nervousness. She let him lead her into the circle of dancers, and after a few uncertain steps, she found the rhythm, letting the music guide her movements. Yates was a good dancer, confident but not showy, and he held her with a gentle firmness that made her feel safe. They moved through 2 dances, then 3, and she became aware that her veil kept slipping, that by the 4th dance it had fallen back entirely, leaving her face fully exposed to the lantern light and the curious gazes of Desdemona's citizens. She started to reach up to fix it, but Yates caught her hand. "Leave it," he said quietly. "Let them see who you really are." It was perhaps the bravest thing she had ever done, continuing to dance with her scars visible, her imperfections on display for anyone who cared to look. But something shifted inside her with each turn around the makeshift dance floor, something that felt like the first tentative steps toward healing. When the music finally paused for a break, they retreated to get some of the punch that one of the church ladies had prepared. A woman approached them, young and pretty with blonde curls and a dress that was far too fancy for a church social in a dusty oil town. "Yates Foster," she said, her voice honey-sweet. "I have been waiting all evening for you to ask me to dance." "Surely you have not forgotten our conversation at the Mercantile last week, Miss Sinclair," Yates replied, his tone polite but cool. "I believe I mentioned then that I would be bringing a guest to the social. May I introduce Miss Wilhelmina Walsh?" Caroline Sinclair's gaze slid over Wilhelmina with barely concealed disdain, lingering on her scars. "Oh yes, the seamstress," she said dismissively. "How convenient that you have someone to repair your work clothes." Wilhelmina felt heat rise in her cheeks, the familiar sting of being reduced to her usefulness. But before she could respond, Yates stepped forward, placing himself partially between them. "Miss Walsh is a skilled artisan and a fine woman," he said, his voice dropping into a register that was almost dangerous. "And she is worth 10 of the social climbers who have been throwing themselves at me since I bought my ranch. Now, if you will excuse us, I promised her the next dance." He took Wilhelmina's arm and led her away, leaving Caroline Sinclair sputtering with indignation. Once they were out of earshot, Wilhelmina let out a shaky laugh. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I am accustomed to people like her." "Well, you should not have to be," Yates replied firmly. "And I meant every word I said. You are worth more than all the pretty faces in Texas combined." The music started up again, a slower waltz this time, and he pulled her close, one hand at her waist and the other clasping hers. They moved together in silence for a while, and Wilhelmina let herself imagine what it might be like to have this always, to have someone who saw past her scars to the woman underneath, who defended her against casual cruelty and made her feel like she mattered. "Tell me about the fire," Yates said quietly as they turned. "You do not have to if you do not want to, but I would like to know what happened." She had not spoken about it in detail to anyone, had kept the memories locked away in a dark corner of her mind. But something about the night, about the music and the warmth of his hand on her waist, made her want to share the burden she had been carrying alone. "It was spring," she began, her voice barely audible over the fiddles. "Late April, and we had just finished planting. My father and brother had been clearing brush away from the barn, making a pile to burn once the ground was wetter. But the wind came up suddenly, the way it does in Missouri, and a spark from my mother's cook stove must have blown out and caught the dry grass. By the time we realized what was happening, The fire was already spreading. She paused, and Yates gave her hand a gentle squeeze, encouraging her to continue. My father got my mother and brother out of the house, but I was upstairs in my room, sewing by the window, and I did not smell the smoke until it was too late. The stairs were already engulfed. My father came back for me, climbed up the outside and broke through my window. He got me out, but the roof was starting to collapse. He pushed me away, told me to run, and then he went back in for my mother's jewelry box, the one thing she had from her own mother. He never came back out. The tears were flowing freely now, but she kept talking, the words pouring out like blood from a reopened wound. My brother tried to go in after him, but the whole structure came down. My mother ran toward the house and I tried to stop her, grabbed her arm, but she pulled away and the sleeve of her dress caught fire. The flames spread so fast. I tried to beat them out with my hands with my shawl, but the fire just kept spreading. She died in my arms screaming and I could not save her, could not save any of them. And you were burned trying, Yates said, understanding clear in his voice. My hands, my arms, my face, she confirmed. The doctor in town did what he could, but there was so much damage. I spent 3 months recovering, and when I was finally well enough to leave, I sold what was left and left Missouri behind. I could not stay there, could not look at the ruins every day and remember what I had lost. They had stopped dancing, standing still in the middle of the floor while couples moved around them. Yates raised his hand and cupped her scarred cheek with infinite gentleness. "You are the bravest person I have ever met," he said fiercely. "To survive that, to keep going, to build a new life. That takes more courage than most people have in their entire bodies." "I do not feel brave," she whispered. "I feel broken." "We are all broken in one way or another," he replied, "but that does not mean we cannot be whole with the right person beside us." He kissed her then, softly and carefully, his lips warm against hers, and Wilhelmina felt something inside her chest crack open, letting in light for the first time in 2 years. When they pulled apart, she was aware that several people were staring, but she found that she did not care. For the first time since the fire, she felt like a woman rather than a victim, like someone who deserved tenderness and affection. They left the social shortly after that, both of them ready to escape the crowds and the scrutiny. The ride back to town was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between two people who have shared something important and do not need words to fill the space. When they reached the general store, Yates helped her down from the wagon and walked her to the back door that led to her upstairs room. "May I call on you tomorrow?" he asked. "Maybe take you out to see my ranch. I think you would like it out there. It is peaceful, and the wildflowers are still blooming despite the heat." "I would like that very much," Wilhelmina said, meaning it with her whole heart. He kissed her again, longer this time, and she allowed herself to lean into it, to feel the solid warmth of him and the promise of something more. When he finally left, she climbed the stairs to her room in a daze, barely able to process everything that had happened. She slept better that night than she had in months, and when she woke the next morning, she did not immediately reach for her veil. She studied herself in the mirror, looking at her scars with something approaching acceptance. They were part of her story, part of what had shaped her, but they did not have to define her future. Yates arrived mid-morning after Wilhelmina had helped Judith with the early rush of customers. He had brought a gentle mare for her to ride, explaining that the wagon would be too slow for the distance they needed to cover. Wilhelmina had not ridden in years, but the skills came back quickly, and soon they were trotting out of Desdemona, heading west into the rolling scrubland. His ranch, when they reached it, was modest but well-maintained. The house was a sturdy single-story structure built from local stone, with a wide porch and windows positioned to catch the breeze. The barn was newer, the wood still light-colored, and several corrals held horses and a small herd of cattle. Everything spoke of careful management and hard work. "It is not much yet," Yates said, dismounting and helping her down, "but I've got plans to expand. There is a creek that runs through the north pasture, and the grazing is good. In another 5 years, I could have one of the better operations in the county if I keep at it." "It is beautiful," Wilhelmina said honestly. "You should be proud of what you have built." He showed her around, pointing out the various improvements he had made, the new well he had dug, the garden plot where he attempted to grow vegetables with varying degrees of success. Then he led her to a spot near the creek where wildflowers grew in profusion, yellows and purples and delicate whites swaying in the breeze. They sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, and Yates unpacked the lunch he had brought. Simple food, but plenty of it. As they ate, they talked about everything and nothing, their conversation ranging from childhood memories to philosophical questions about life and purpose. Wilhelmina found herself laughing more than she had in years, and she realized with a start that she was happy, genuinely happy, for the first time since before the fire. "Can I ask you something personal?" Yates said as they finished eating. "After everything I told you last night, I think you have earned the right," she replied. "Why do you still wear the veil?" he asked. "I understand needing it at first, needing protection while you healed, but it has been 2 years. Do you really still need it, or is it more about keeping people at a distance?" The question struck deep, hitting a truth she had been avoiding. "Both, I suppose," she admitted slowly. "In the beginning, it was because I could not stand to see the pity in people's eyes, the way they looked at me like I was something pathetic. But now I think you are right. It is easier to hide than to risk being hurt. Has anyone ever told you that you do not have to be strong all the time?" Yates asked gently. "That it is okay to be vulnerable, to let someone else help carry the weight. My mother used to say something like that," Wilhelmina said, her voice thick with emotion. "But she died believing I had failed her, that I could not save her." "She died knowing you tried," Yates corrected. "She died knowing she was loved. That is not failure, Wilhelmina. That is the best any of us can hope for." They stayed by the creek until late afternoon, reluctant to return to the noise and demands of town. When they finally rode back, the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. Over the following weeks, Yates became a constant presence in Wilhelmina's life. He came by the store almost daily, sometimes with legitimate business, sometimes just to talk while she worked. On Sundays, he took her out to the ranch, and she began to feel at home there, learning the rhythms of ranch life and even helping with some of the lighter tasks. She discovered she had a knack for working with the horses, and Yates taught her to ride with more confidence, to move with the animal rather than against it. The people of Desdemona gradually grew accustomed to seeing them together, and while there was still gossip, particularly from women like Caroline Sinclair who had set their sights on Yates and his ranch, most folks seemed to accept their courtship as a natural development. Wilhelmina found herself being invited to various social events, and while she still wore a light veil in public, she no longer felt the need to hide completely. It was late October when everything changed. Yates had mentioned he needed to make a trip to Fort Worth to negotiate the sale of some cattle, a journey that would take him away for nearly 2 weeks. Wilhelmina felt his absence acutely, realizing just how much she had come to rely on his presence, his steady support and gentle encouragement. She threw herself into her work, taking on extra projects to keep her mind occupied. One afternoon, a young woman came into the store, her face bruised and her dress torn, asking in a timid voice if anyone could help her. Judith immediately took charge, bringing the woman into the back room and calling for Wilhelmina. The woman's name was Sarah, and she was barely 20, married to one of the roughnecks who worked the oil fields. Her husband, she explained haltingly, had a temper that grew worse with drink, and the previous night he had beaten her so badly she feared for her life. Wilhelmina felt a fierce protectiveness rise up in her, the same instinct that had driven her to try to save her mother even when it was clearly hopeless. She helped clean Sarah's wounds, fashioned a dress for her from some spare fabric, and used the money she had been saving to buy the young woman a stagecoach ticket to Dallas, where she had family who could take her in. "Why are you doing this for me?" Sarah asked, tears streaming down her face. "You do not even know me." "Because someone helped me when I needed it most," Wilhelmina replied, thinking of Judith's kindness in giving her a chance, of Yates's acceptance and affection. "Because women need to look out for each other, because no one deserves to live in fear." After Sarah left on the evening stage, Judith pulled Wilhelmina aside. "That was a good thing you did," she said quietly. "But her husband is going to come looking for her, and he is going to be angry." "Let him come," Wilhelmina said with more confidence than she felt. "We will tell him she bought a ticket, and we do not know where she went. He cannot prove otherwise." But when the man showed up the next day, drunk and belligerent, demanding to know where his wife had gone, Wilhelmina realized they had underestimated just how dangerous he could be. He was a big man, well over 6 feet and heavily muscled from years of hard labor, and he smelled of whiskey and rage. "I know you helped her," he snarled, grabbing Wilhelmina's arm hard enough to bruise. "You had no right to interfere in my marriage." "You had no right to beat her," Wilhelmina shot back, trying to pull away. "She is gone, and she is not coming back. There is nothing you can do about it." He raised his hand to strike her, and Wilhelmina flinched, but before the blow could land, Sheriff Davis burst through the door, his gun drawn. "That is enough, Patterson," the sheriff said coldly. "Let her go, or I will arrest you right now for assault." The man released her with a curse and stumbled out, muttering threats. The sheriff stayed for a while, making sure he had truly left, and warned Wilhelmina to be careful, to not go out alone after dark until the man had either left town or sobered up enough to see reason. Wilhelmina was badly shaken by the encounter, and for the first time since Yates had left, she felt truly vulnerable, aware of how much she had come to depend on his presence as a source of safety and strength. She found herself counting the days until his return, and when he finally rode back into Desdemona on a cold November morning, she nearly cried with relief. He took one look at the bruises on her arm and his expression turned thunderous. "Who did this to you?" She told him the whole story about Sarah and her escape, about Patterson's rage. Yates listened without interruption, but she could see the anger building in the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. "I am going to have a conversation with Mr. Patterson," he said grimly. "No," Wilhelmina said quickly. "The sheriff already warned him off. It is over. I do not want you getting into trouble on my account." "It is not over if you are walking around with bruises he gave you," Yates replied. "But I will let it go for now because you are asking me to. Just know that if he ever comes near you again, I will not be so restrained." The incident seemed to crystallize something for both of them, an awareness that what they had was deeper and more important than either had fully acknowledged. That evening, after the store had closed and Judith had retired to her own room, Yates asked Wilhelmina to come outside with him. They stood on the back porch, looking up at the stars that seemed impossibly bright and numerous in the clear night sky. Yates took both her hands in his expression serious in the moonlight. "I have been thinking a lot while I was away," he said slowly. "About what I want from life, about what makes a house into a home. And I kept coming back to you, to the way you make me laugh, the way you challenge me to be better, the way you fit into my life like you were always meant to be there." Wilhelmina's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. "Yates, let me finish," he said gently. "I know we have not been courting for very long by conventional standards. It has only been a few months. But I am 26 years old, and I have met enough people to know when something is right. You are right, Wilhelmina. You are right for me in every way that matters." He released one of her hands and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. "I had this made in Fort Worth by a jeweler who does beautiful work. It is not fancy, but I hope you will like it." Inside the box was a ring, a simple gold band with a small sapphire set in the center, the deep blue stone catching the moonlight. "Wilhelmina Walsh, will you marry me? Will you come out to the ranch and help me build that home I have been dreaming about? Will you let me spend the rest of my life showing you how beautiful and valuable and loved you are?" The tears came then, hot and fast, but these were tears of joy rather than grief. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though it had been made specifically for her hand. Then he kissed her with a passion and tenderness that took her breath away, and she clung to him, letting herself believe that she really could have this, that she deserved this happiness after everything she had lost. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church, with Judith and Sheriff Davis standing as witnesses. Wilhelmina wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored silk, and for the first time in 2 years, she did not wear any veil at all. She walked down the aisle with her head held high, her scars visible to everyone present, and when she reached Yates and saw the love shining in his eyes, she knew she had made the right choice. The reception was held at the ranch, with neighbors and friends bringing food and well wishes. Even Caroline Sinclair attended, though she kept her distance and left early with a sniff of disdain. Wilhelmina found that she could not bring herself to care about the judgment of small-minded people when she had Yates beside her, his hand warm in hers, his eyes following her with such obvious devotion that several of the older women commented on how fortunate she was to have found such a good man. Their wedding night was gentle and sweet, Yates taking his time to show her with actions what he had already told her with words, that her scars did not diminish her worth, that she was desirable and cherished. Wilhelmina discovered that intimacy could be healing, that being vulnerable with someone who truly loved her was not weakness but strength. They settled into married life with surprising ease. Wilhelmina continued her sewing work, but now she did it from the ranch house, with a bright workroom that Yates had prepared for her as a wedding gift. Women from town and surrounding ranches began to seek her out for their dressmaking needs, and she built a reputation for fine quality and reasonable prices. Yates expanded the ranch as he had planned, buying adjacent land and increasing his herd. They worked together on the property, Wilhelmina helping with the horses and the garden while Yates managed the cattle and the heavier labor. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and talked about their days, making plans for the future, dreaming together. The first winter of their marriage was harsh, with an unusual cold snap that brought freezing rain and ice. They lost a few cattle to the weather, but they made it through, and when spring arrived with its explosion of wildflowers and new grass, Wilhelmina realized she was pregnant. She told Yates one morning in April, exactly a year after the fire that had changed her life. He whooped with joy and picked her up, spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. Then he set her down carefully, as though she had suddenly become fragile, and placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby," he said with wonder. A family. Wilhelmina echoed, marveling at how much her life had changed in just 2 years. From the ashes of tragedy, she had found love and purpose and a future bright with promise. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Wilhelmina bloomed with health despite the summer heat. Judith came out to the ranch frequently to check on her, bringing supplies and advice and her own special brand of no-nonsense comfort. Yates was almost comically protective, insisting that Wilhelmina rest frequently and refusing to let her do any heavy work. "I am pregnant, not dying," she would tell him with exasperation, but secretly she loved his attentiveness, the way he treated her as though she were precious and irreplaceable. Their son was born in December during a rare snowfall that dusted the Texas scrubland with white. The labor was long and difficult, but when Wilhelmina finally held the tiny, red-faced infant in her arms, she understood for the first time what her mother must have felt, the overwhelming love that made you willing to do anything, risk anything, for this small person. "What should we name him?" Yates asked, his voice rough with emotion as he cradled both wife and child. "William," Wilhelmina said immediately, "after my father, William Foster." "William Foster," Yates repeated, testing the name. "I like it. He is going to be strong like your father and brave like his mother." Those early months of parenthood were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. William was a hungry baby, demanding and vocal, but he was also sweet-natured when content, and both parents were utterly besotted. Wilhelmina had worried that she would not know how to be a mother, that the trauma of losing her own family would somehow interfere, but she found that maternal instinct was strong and sure, guiding her through the sleepless nights and endless feedings. As William grew from infant to baby to toddler, the ranch prospered. Yates had become known as one of the most reliable ranchers in the area, and his cattle brought premium prices. Wilhelmina's sewing business continued to grow, and she began training a young woman from town as an assistant, teaching her the skills that would allow her to earn her own living. When William was 3, Wilhelmina became pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect. Their daughter arrived in early summer, a tiny thing with dark hair and her father's creek water eyes. They named her Caroline, not after the spiteful woman from town, but after Yates's grandmother, who he remembered as a woman of great strength and kindness. Life fell into a comfortable rhythm, the years marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. William grew tall and serious, with his mother's artistic eye and his father's steady temperament. Caroline was wilder, always running off to explore, unafraid of horses or dirt or hard work. Yates taught them both to ride as soon as they could walk, and Wilhelmina taught them to read and write and appreciate the beauty in small things. Desdemona changed around them, the oil boom eventually fading as wells ran dry and workers moved on to the next opportunity. The town shrank but stabilized, becoming a proper community with a school and a church and businesses that catered to ranchers rather than roughnecks. The Foster Ranch became one of the anchors of the local economy, providing employment and contributing to civic improvements. Wilhelmina never stopped wearing her scars, but she stopped hiding them. She learned to look people in the eye without flinching, to accept compliments without deflecting, to believe that she was worthy of the love she had found. Children occasionally asked about her face, and she would tell them honestly that she had been in a fire, that sometimes bad things happened to good people, but that did not mean life was over, that healing was possible even when you thought you had lost everything. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised her with a trip back to Missouri. She had not returned since leaving after the fire, had not wanted to face the memories, but he convinced her that it was time, that she needed to say a proper goodbye to her family and the life she had lived before. They left the children with Judith and made the journey by train, a luxury that would have been unthinkable when Wilhelmina had first come to Texas. The farm where she had grown up had been bought by another family, and they had rebuilt the house and barn, planting new fields where the old ones had burned. It was strange to see it transformed, no longer the site of tragedy but simply a working farm like any other. They visited the small cemetery where her parents and brother were buried, and Wilhelmina stood at the graves and told them about her life, about Yates and the children, about the happiness she had found. She cried, but these were cleansing tears, a release of grief that had been held too tightly for too long. "Thank you," she told Yates as they prepared to leave Missouri and return to Texas. "I needed this more than I realized." "I know," he said simply, taking her hand. "You needed to see that you could face the past and not be destroyed by it, that you are stronger than the things that tried to break you." Back in Texas, they resumed their lives with renewed appreciation for what they had built. More children came, 2 more boys and another girl, until their house was full of noise and laughter and the organized chaos that comes with a large family. The ranch continued to prosper, expanding until it was one of the largest operations in the county. Wilhelmina became known not just for her sewing skills, but for her kindness and wisdom. Women came to her for advice about everything from marriage troubles to child rearing, and she always had time to listen, to offer counsel born of her own experiences. She never forgot what it felt like to be broken and afraid, and she used that knowledge to help others who were struggling. Yates aged well, his dark hair going silver at the temples, his body remaining strong and capable from years of ranch work. He never lost the ability to make Wilhelmina laugh, to surprise her with small gestures of affection, to look at her as though she were the most beautiful woman in the world. Their children grew up secure in the knowledge that they were loved, that their home was a place of safety and acceptance. When Judith died at the age of 78, Wilhelmina inherited the general store, which by then had been expanded and modernized. She turned it over to William, who had shown an aptitude for business, and he ran it successfully while also helping manage the ranch. Caroline married a doctor who had come to Desdemona to establish a practice, and they built a house in town, giving Wilhelmina and Yates their first grandchildren. The years passed with the inexorable march of time, bringing joys and sorrows in equal measure. They lost friends to illness and age, saw Desdemona continue to evolve, watched as automobiles began to replace horses on the streets. But through it all, their love remained constant, the foundation upon which everything else was built. On a warm spring evening, when Wilhelmina was 62 and Yates was 64, they sat on the porch of the ranch house and watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. 5 grandchildren were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the breeze, and the smell of Caroline's pot roast drifted from the kitchen where she was preparing dinner. "You ever regret it?" Wilhelmina asked, reaching over to take Yates's hand. "Marrying a scarred woman and taking on all the complications that came with it." Yates looked at her with those creek water eyes that still made her heart skip after all these years. "Not for one single second," he said firmly. "You are the best decision I ever made, Wilhelmina Foster. The very best. You saved me," she said softly. "When you lifted my veil that day in the store, when you told me I was beautiful, you gave me back a life I thought was over." "We saved each other," he corrected, raising her hand to his lips and kissing the backs of her fingers. "I was just existing before you came along, going through the motions. You showed me what it meant to truly live, to open my heart to someone else, to build something that mattered. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to be grateful every morning when I wake up." She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart. Around them, the ranch stretched out in all directions, the land they had worked and nurtured and shaped together. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, and the new barn that William had helped build stood proud against the darkening sky. This was home, she thought, not just the physical place but the life they had created, the love they had cultivated, the family they had raised. She had come to Texas broken and afraid, hiding behind a veil and believing she had nothing left to offer. But Yates had seen past the scars to the woman underneath, had believed in her when she could not believe in herself, had loved her not despite her imperfections but including them, scars and all. "I love you," she whispered, the words as true now as they had been on their wedding day 4 decades earlier. "I love you too," he replied, and in those simple words was a world of meaning, a lifetime of shared experiences, of weathering storms together and celebrating triumphs, of building something beautiful from the ruins of what came before. The grandchildren ran up to the porch, demanding stories, and Wilhelmina gathered them close, beginning to tell them about a time long ago when the oil boom brought people from all over to a dusty Texas town, when a scarred woman arrived on a stagecoach and met a cowboy who saw beauty where others saw only damage. She told them about courage and kindness, about second chances and the healing power of love, about the importance of looking past surfaces to see the truth of a person's heart. Yates listened with a smile, adding details she forgot, correcting her good-naturedly when she embellished for dramatic effect. The children listened with rapt attention, and Wilhelmina felt a profound sense of gratitude for this moment, for this life, for the journey that had brought her from the ashes of tragedy to the warmth of this full and generous life. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky and Caroline called everyone in for dinner, Wilhelmina took one last look around at the ranch, at the land and the buildings and the family that represented everything she held dear. She thought about the girl she had been, hiding behind a veil, convinced she had no future. She thought about the woman she had become, strong and confident and loved. The scars were still there, would always be there, a permanent reminder of the fire that had taken so much from her. But they were also a testament to survival, to resilience, to the human capacity for healing and growth. They were part of her story, but they were not the whole story. The whole story was written in the faces of her children and grandchildren, in the solid presence of the man beside her, in the life they had built together against all odds. Inside, the house was warm and bright, filled with the sounds of family gathering for a meal. Wilhelmina took her place at the table, Yates at her right hand as always, and looked around at the faces she loved most in the world. This, she thought, was what happiness looked like. Not the absence of scars or pain or difficulty, but the presence of love strong enough to carry you through whatever came. They ate together, sharing food and stories and laughter, the meal stretching long into the evening as meals with family often do. When the children were finally tucked into bed and the dishes were washed and Caroline and her family had departed for their own home in town, Wilhelmina and Yates returned to the porch, unwilling to end the perfect day. 40 years ago, I never would have imagined this, Wilhelmina said, leaning against Yates as they watched the moon rise over the pastures. I thought my life was over. I thought I would spend whatever years I had left alone and isolated, that no one would ever want me. Their loss, Yates said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I got the prize, she laughed, the sound soft in the quiet night. You were always good at making me believe I was worth something. Because you are, he said seriously. You always have been. I just helped you see what was already there." They stayed on the porch until late, reluctant to go inside, wanting to hold onto the peace and contentment of the evening a little longer. When they finally retired to their bedroom, they moved with the comfortable ease of long intimacy, preparing for sleep with the efficient coordination of two people who had shared space for decades. As Wilhelmina brushed out her hair, now mostly gray but still thick and healthy, she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. The scars were still visible, still a prominent feature of her appearance, but she no longer saw them as disfigurement. They were simply part of her face, part of who she was, no more worthy of focus than the laugh lines around her eyes or the few age spots on her hands. Yates came up behind her, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Still the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," he said. And she knew he meant it, knew that when he looked at her he saw everything they had built together. Every moment of joy and struggle, every laugh and tear and triumph. "You are impossible," she said, but she was smiling as she turned to kiss him. They climbed into bed, and Wilhelmina settled into the curve of Yates's body, feeling safe and loved and content in a way that had once seemed impossible. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys. There would be work to do and decisions to make and the endless business of living. But tonight, she had everything she needed right here in this room, in this bed, in the arms of the man who had seen past her scars and loved the woman underneath. The years continued to roll by, bringing changes and constants in equal measure. William took over more of the ranch management as Yates began to slow down, though the older man still insisted on riding out to check the herds most days. Their other children scattered somewhat, pursuing their own lives and dreams, but they always came back for holidays and celebrations, bringing their own children and eventually grandchildren, until family gatherings required borrowing extra chairs from the neighbors. Wilhelmina's sewing business evolved into something more like a mentorship program, with her teaching skills to young women who wanted to earn their own living. She took pride in seeing her students go on to establish their own successful businesses, several of them crediting her with giving them the confidence and skills to make their way in the world. The town of Desdemona continued its own evolution, adapting to the changing times while maintaining its essential character. The oil that had once been its lifeblood became less important, but the ranching and farming that had sustained the region for generations continued. The Foster Ranch remained a cornerstone of the community, known for fair dealing and quality livestock. On their 50th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren threw them a party that brought half the county to the ranch. There was food and music and dancing, stories told and retold of Yates and Wilhelmina's courtship and the early days of their marriage. Several of the older residents remembered when Wilhelmina had first arrived, veiled and vulnerable, and marveled at the transformation she had undergone. "I remember when you first came to that church social," one elderly woman said, taking Wilhelmina's hands in her own. "I was not kind in my thoughts, I am ashamed to say, but you showed all of us what real courage looks like, what real beauty is. You and Yates have built something remarkable here." "We were blessed," Wilhelmina said simply. "We found each other when we both needed someone to believe in us." As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Wilhelmina and Yates found themselves alone on the porch once again, in the spot that had become their sanctuary over the decades. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, and the night sounds of the ranch provided a familiar symphony. 50 years, Yates mused. It has gone by so fast. Feels like just yesterday I was working up the courage to ask you to that first social. "The best decision you ever made," Wilhelmina teased, echoing his words from years past. "The very best," he agreed, pulling her close. "I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every moment, every challenge, every joy, all of it as long as it was with you." They sat in comfortable silence. No words necessary, just the presence of the person who knew them best and loved them most. Wilhelmina thought about the long road that had brought her here, from the ashes of the fire to this moment of perfect contentment. She thought about the girl who had hidden behind a veil, so convinced of her own unworthiness that she could not imagine anyone ever looking at her with love. But Yates had looked, and he had seen, and he had loved. And in doing so, he had taught her to love herself, to see value where she had seen only damage, to understand that beauty was not about perfection but about authenticity, about being brave enough to show your true self to another person and trust that they would handle your heart with care. The scars that had once seemed like a curse had become, in their way, a gift. They had taught her empathy and compassion, had given her insight into suffering that allowed her to help others, had been the reason she came to Texas and met the man who would become her everything. Without the fire, without the scars, she would have lived a completely different life, probably married some local boy in Missouri, raised her family on her parents' farm, and never known the depth of love and partnership she had found with Yates. It was a strange thing to be grateful for tragedy, but Wilhelmina had learned that life was complex, that good and bad were often intertwined in ways that could not be separated. The fire had taken her family, but it had also led her to find a new family. The scars had marked her, but they had also been the catalyst for the most important relationship of her life. As they finally headed inside to sleep, Wilhelmina took one last look around at the ranch bathed in moonlight. This was her legacy, she realized. Not just the land or the buildings or the successful business, but the love that permeated every inch of this place, the family that had been built here, the life that she and Yates had created together through hard work and devotion, and an absolute refusal to give up on each other. In the bedroom, she removed the simple necklace Yates had given her for their 25th anniversary and placed it carefully in her jewelry box. Her hands were gnarled now with age and years of work, but they were still steady, still capable. She caught sight of her reflection again and paused, really looking at herself. The woman in the mirror was old. There was no denying that. Her hair was white, her skin creased with wrinkles, her body bent slightly from years of labor. The scars were still there, faded somewhat but still visible, still a map of the worst day of her life. But she also saw strength in that face, wisdom in those eyes, contentment in the set of her mouth. "Beautiful," Yates said from the bed, watching her. "Still so beautiful to me." And she believed him, finally, completely, without reservation. After 50 years of marriage, she understood that beauty was in the eye of the beholder, that the way Yates saw her was shaped by love and history and shared experience, that to him, she would always be the brave woman who had survived tragedy and built a new life, the partner who had stood beside him through good times and bad, the mother of his children and the keeper of his heart. She joined him in bed and they held each other in the darkness, two souls who had found each other against all odds and had made something lasting and true. Tomorrow would bring whatever tomorrow brought, but tonight they had this, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The final years of their lives passed gently, marked by the quiet joys of watching grandchildren and great-grandchildren grow, of tending the garden and sitting on the porch, of being present for each moment without rushing toward the next. Yates's health began to fail first, his strong body finally showing the wear of decades of hard work. But he remained sharp and engaged until the very end. He died on a spring morning when the wildflowers were in full bloom, surrounded by family, with Wilhelmina holding his hand. His last words were for her alone, whispered so softly that she had to lean close to hear them. "You made my life complete," he said. "Every day with you was a gift. I love you." "I love you too," she whispered back, tears streaming down her scarred face. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for everything." He smiled, squeezed her hand one last time and slipped away peacefully, his expression serene. Wilhelmina sat with him for a long time afterward, holding his hand even as it grew cold, remembering every moment of their 53 years together, every laugh and argument and tender gesture. She grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been blessed with a long life together, with love that had sustained them through everything, with a family that would carry their legacy forward. She had no complaints, no wishes for more time, because she understood better than most that life was precious precisely because it was finite, that every moment mattered because there were only so many of them. She lived for 3 more years, staying on the ranch that had been her home for more than 5 decades, surrounded by children and grandchildren who made sure she was never alone. She continued her sewing, teaching her great-granddaughters the skills that had once saved her, passing on not just technique but philosophy, the understanding that there was dignity and purpose in creating something beautiful with your own hands. On a summer evening, Wilhelmina sat on the porch for the last time, watching the sun set over the land she had loved so well. She was tired, ready to rest, ready to see Yates again if such things were possible. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the farm in Missouri to Desdemona, from hiding behind a veil to standing proud in her own skin, from believing she was unlovable to knowing deep in her bones that she had been cherished. The cowboy had lifted her veil and told her she was beautiful, and in doing so he had changed everything. He had given her permission to be herself, scars and all. He had shown her that love was not about perfection, but about acceptance, about choosing to see the best in someone and helping them become the person they were meant to be. As the last light faded from the sky, Wilhelmina closed her eyes and let go, slipping away as gently as a sigh. And if there was indeed something beyond this life, then surely Yates was there waiting for her, ready to take her hand and lead her into whatever came next, just as he had done in that dusty general store in Texas more than 50 years before. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, generations of residents who had known her or been touched by her kindness, or simply respected what she represented. They buried her next to Yates on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a simple headstone that read, "Wilhelmina Walsh Foster, beloved wife, mother, and friend. She taught us that true beauty comes from within." The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through William to his children and grandchildren, each generation adding their own touches while respecting the foundation that Yates and Wilhelmina had built. The house on the hill remained, sturdy and welcoming, a testament to the love that had created it and the family that continued to fill it with life and laughter. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wildflowers were blooming and the stars were bright, people swore they could feel a presence on that porch, 2 souls still sitting together after all these years, still holding hands, still finding peace and contentment in each other's company. It was just a story, of course, the kind of romantic tale that people like to tell about couples who loved deeply and well. But whether it was true or not did not really matter. What mattered was the legacy they had left behind, the proof that love could triumph over tragedy, that scars did not have to define you, that with the right person beside you, even the broken pieces of a life could be made whole again. What mattered was that a scarred woman and a cowboy with creek water eyes had found each other in a dusty Texas town, and had built something beautiful that endured long after they were gone. Their story became part of the fabric of Desdemona, told and retold to children and grandchildren, a reminder that real love sees past the surface to the soul beneath. That courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the greatest adventures come from simply being brave enough to take off your veil and let someone see who you really are. And in that story, in that legacy, Wilhelmina and Yates Foster lived on, their love as enduring as the Texas scrubland, as constant as the stars, as true as the vows they had spoken on their wedding day more than half a century before.